Hey everybody, welcome back to these Behaviour Revolution scriptures. It's been a while since we dived into First Kings, but we're going to continue on in it. And where have we been? We've seen the Temple of Solomon being built. We've seen Solomon rise and raise Yisrael up to its highest zenith of power and prestige and global extravagance. They're a superpower on the earth. And today, we're going to see, we even had this Queen of Sheba last episode. And so it's been a few months since we've had time to do this, but we're getting back into it. And today, let's have a look. We're going to see the sad downfall of Yahuwah's people, all through one man and his 1,000 wives, 700 wives, 300 concubines. 1,000 wives. That's just 1,000 wives too, 999 wives too many. Wow. Just imagine 1,000 women living with 1,000. Wow. Let's go. Let's have a look at what this is about. 1,000 wives. And yes, I've counted most of those heads, and there are about 1,000 wives in that picture. It's to scale. Yeah. Imagine that being your household. That's insane. 1,000. Wow. We concluded our last chapter by being introduced to the famous Queen of Sheba, whose name, it turns out, is actually more closely to the Queen of Saba. Today's chapter could easily be called The Reasons for the Division of the Kingdom of Yisrael. The reasons for the division of the Kingdom of Yisrael. And as we know, the exile, judgment, divorce, all that happened, we just finished a summary the other night, starting off the book of Daniel. So it's interesting that Yahusha's made this able to continue now. So we're kind of coming at it from both ends. So today's chapter could be the reasons for the division of the Kingdom of Yisrael, because we are given four basic premises of the author of this scripture book for how it could be. How it could be that the united and sovereign nation of Israel, an admired and powerful, wealthy country, how it would fall into ruin and civil war and split into two kingdoms within a few months after Solomon's death. This is our last chapter dealing with Solomon, guys. This is we're going to see the death of Solomon by the end of it. And so the sad and sorry state of Solomon is explained to us in this chapter here. The four reasons for what? The four reasons for the split, the division. Four reasons are: one, Solomon's deliberate and outrageous behavior towards his people, that mirrored of a typical Middle Eastern monarch, instead of a set apart and anointed king, whose Elohim was Yahuwah and whose guide was the Torah. He was living more like a dictator, almost a tyrant. The heavy taxes he was putting on top of people. He was getting real money hungry. For someone who didn't ask for any of that in the beginning, he's certainly running with it. Secondly, the reason for the split: as a consequence of this bad behavior, Yahuwah raised up adversaries to weaken Solomon's kingdom and prepare it to be torn apart. 3, Jeroboam, we're going to hear about him soon. Jeroboam always sought power and esteem, and so Yahuwah used him as a tool to wreak havoc and be the leader of the rebels who wanted to overthrow David's dynasty. Number 4, Solomon's idolatry that had its roots in his vast harem of foreign wives and concubines was a severe offense towards Yahuwah, and it couldn't go unpunished. Or Yahuwah would not be a righteous and just Elohim, would he? So, we're just a bit of a summary up front so we know where we're going with this. So we'll see the tragic end of Solomon's life today, one that Judaism has gone a long way to find ways around. They're trying to work their way around this. How can we make Solomon innocent in this? They've tried to go all the way around it. They prefer to label Yahuwah's judgments and pronouncements against Solomon as criticisms. and to ignore statements that Solomon descended into deep idolatry and did what was evil in Yahuwah's eyes. And instead, they say that Solomon remained righteous, but he was just a bad boy at times. Ridiculous. What we read, however, says something very different. The master had kept his promise to Solomon of giving him whatever he asked for in Yahuwah's first appearance to Solomon at Gibeon at the beginning of his reign. The new king asked the master for wisdom, and the master gave it to him in abundance. But Yahuwah told Solomon that he would also give him great wealth because he didn't ask for it. Early on, Solomon indeed attained a large measure of wealth, but it only seemed to whet his appetite for more. It became obvious that what the master had offered Solomon as heavenly blessing turned into an uncontrollable lust and greed for what Solomon could glean for himself from anyone and everyone. But Yahuwah's blessings had come with a condition. Solomon was to be obedient to Yahuwah and maintain himself operating on a high spiritual plane. Because Solomon was made king of Israel at a time when David had conquered most of his enemies, and so handed over to Solomon a peaceful and substantial kingdom. Young Solomon began his reign at the highest spiritual level. He was determined to build and complete a temple to Yahuwah as his first major endeavor, and he devoted himself to that effort. But from there forward, it became a race to the bottom. Remember, he was one of the youngest sons too of David. He was quite younger than a lot of his older brothers who just assumed they'd be getting the throne. But so he had a lot to prove. So even though he had a heart for Yahuwah at the beginning, all the way through he had a heart for Yahuwah. We'll see that when he wrote, later on before we finish, I'm just going to show you a few bits in Ecclesiastes, what he wrote, one of the last things he wrote at the end of his life. And we'll see that he'd learnt a lot of his lessons, but as we know with Yahuwah, the consequences were still there. So let's go on. Let's get into the scripture. 1,000 wives. 1 Kings chapter 11. The reason for the division. King Solomon loved many foreign women, including the daughter of Pharaoh, that was his first wife, and women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and the Hittites. Yahuwah had previously said to the Israelites, you must not go into, which means have sex or marry, you must not go into people from other nations or allow them to do that with you. For if you do, they'll cause you to turn your heart away from me, to follow their false deities. So he said that centuries before. But Solomon fell in love with all these women and clung to them. That's what the scripture says. He clung to them, loved them. Here we see Solomon's infamy that turned to amassing an enormous harem. He is said to have loved many foreign wives, and one could argue if loving that many women simultaneously is even humanly possible. We are plainly told that he married Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Hittite women, as well as women from Sidon, which is King Hiram's nation, who helped bring the materials for the temple. This was firmly against Torah law, all these wives. I mean, this was a polygamous society, but this was firmly against Torah law. And the main concern Yahuwah had that caused him to outlaw such marriages was that these foreign women would turn the Israelites' hearts towards false deities and away from Yahuwah. So let's be clear. The perfect pattern of marriage is one man, one woman. For the sake of populating the earth, and it became a cultural norm, particularly in this era and with the Israelites as well, polygamy, having multiple wives, was allowed, but not from other nations. Not allowed. And the main reason was not because you'd have drama in the house and jealousies and all that. That's just standard. The drama for Yahuwah was, I don't want you turning your hearts to other Elohims. That's the main big no-no. As we see here, it all got turned. He started bringing in. See? Big difference between King David. I mentioned this later on. King David made mistakes and he had consequences, but he never worshipped false idols. He never got into idolatry. His heart was always for Yahuwah. We're told that Solomon was deeply attached to them by his love. Let's be clear about what is being said. Solomon let his own feelings and definition of love, override Yahuwah's laws. Solomon was a brilliant man, and he had a stellar royal court of the finest minds who knew the Torah well. The king knew that marrying these women was indefensible, legally speaking, but it didn't matter, for he felt that he loved them all, and he wasn't about to give even one of them up. And as we find out in the Song of Solomon, King Solomon was an incurable romantic. He was in love with love. Where love was involved, little else mattered. After all, Yahuwah is an Elohim of love, right? So if we love something, or especially someone, then that love rises above everything else, doesn't it? Yahuwah's laws and commands become secondary to our self-decisions. Solomon is the perfect old covenant example of a modern believer who thinks incorrectly. That deliverance means that whatever love we feel replaces obedience and renders it not only obsolete but undesirable. But we know we must stay in him, love what he loves and hate what he hates. It's about loving him first, and then everything else filters down into wife, husband, children, etc. So Solomon just loved love. Loved loving the love he loved, yeah. Solomon had 700 wives. You saw the picture up the top with all those women? 700 wives, princesses from other nations. So it's not actually that he was in love with love all the time. He was making deals, shady deals with people. And a lot of the ways that you'd make deals back then was you to exchange your daughter or your wife, or you know what I mean? You'd marry into to get power, political movements in there. Like he did with the Pharaoh. He married the Pharaoh's daughter to get close with Egypt. Another commandment he broke. Don't go back to Egypt. Solomon had 700 wives, princesses, not servants, princesses from other nations. He also had 300 slave women, concubines, who were like wives to him. Why would you need 300 slave wives if you've got 700 real wives? All these wives caused him to turn his heart away from Yahuwah. And by the time he was old, Solomon's wives had caused him to follow other false deities, to the point where he didn't serve Yahuwah completely as his father did. So as I said, David made mistakes, but the scripture says that he continued to serve Yahuwah completely. Big difference with making mistakes and repenting. We all do that. But Solomon willfully turned his back and followed other deities, worshipped idols. Solomon married 700 wives and also maintained 300 concubines. A wife is fully married according to the laws of Torah. And as such, a marriage can only be ended with a divorce certificate. However, a concubine did not receive a marriage document, did not qualify for a divorce certificate if he was through with her, and yet her husband was still obligated to care for her, and she may not live with or consort with another man. Solomon's polygamy was not the only Torah commandment concerning Israel's kings that he broke. So she was still considered a wife, just not an official one. There wasn't a certificate of marriage, and you didn't have to give her one of divorce if you were done with her. But she still had to be looked after, and she still had a lot of the same rights, and bore a lot of the children, as we saw with Jacob and his servant wives, still bore a lot of the children for the family. So they weren't just like, this isn't a slavery type thing as such. She was still cherished as a wife, just not official capacity. So Solomon broke lots of laws. This is one of the main ones, Deuteronomy 17. However, he, the king, you want to have a king? You insist on having a king? Well, then he's got to do this. He is not to acquire many horses for himself, or have the people return to Egypt to obtain more horses, inasmuch as Yahuwah told you never to go back that way again. Don't go back there. Look what I did to bring you out. Likewise, he is not to acquire many wives for himself. This is the king. Do not acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart will not turn away. Funny about that. And he is not to acquire excessive quantities of silver and gold. But he's the king. Isn't he allowed to be the richest man in the nation? Yahuwah's definition of a king was to be an under shepherd to him, an under king to him who is the real king. You are an emissary of him, not like a kings of the nations, tyrants. Solomon had lost sight of this. The previous chapter spent a huge amount of time itemizing the vast amounts of gold and silver that Solomon had obtained, much of it purchased upon the backs of forced labourers whose work was taxed, and of the extensive army of chariots and horses he had built up. Further, that he led his people back to Egypt in every imaginable way, including even having an Egyptian wife that appears to have been his favourite wife and the one above all his other wives, creating an almost sister state alliance with Egypt. Sister state alliance with Egypt. And buying all of his horses from Egypt. I mean, don't they realise who the Egyptians are? What the history is? That'd be like the Jews and the Germans joining together today, wouldn't it? I mean, we can be friends, but let's not just forget our history. No, we're not forgetting what went down. No. Solomon has. Sister state alliance. And now in chapter 11, today, he acquired so many wives and concubines that people today question whether such an amount was even feasible. Interestingly, however, it is always idolatry that is the worst of the worst offences that we can commit against Yahuwah. The slippery slope to idolatry is not the amassing of too many horses, nor is it a treasury full of gold and silver, as bad as the king doing those things might be. Rather, it is the marriage to non-Hebrew women who maintain allegiance to false deities, that leads inevitably to idolatry. Polygamy in and of itself was not wrong in ancient times, not the perfect pattern, but it wasn't wrong, it was permitted. But due to the hardness of men's hearts, the prevalence of divorce in Hebrew society forced Paul to define rules of decency and justice towards marriage and divorced women. So it was that Yahuwah, through Moses, was forced to define rules for men who married more than one wife and or maintained concubines, because polygamy was so prevalent in Hebrew society. And the men weren't really doing it the right way and being honourable or dignified to the wives that they didn't want anymore. So Moses there's lots of instructions in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and whatnot, Numbers, about how to live. The difference between Solomon and his father, I touched on this. The difference between Solomon and his father David is that David had remained wholehearted towards Yahuwah. In Hebrew, this statement literally translates to, Solomon did not go fully after Yahuwah. Solomon, take this to heart, Solomon did not go fully after Yahuwah. If we're not going fully after Yahusha, guys, we're being like Solomon. If you've been given a narrow path, a direction to walk on, and you're not going wholeheartedly, you're borderlining on idolatry, because what's in your way? It's got to be something else, because otherwise you'd be running full on the way Yahusha wants you to go. What this is referring to, this statement, what it's referring to is loyalty. Solomon quit being loyal only to the Elohim of Israel. We spent months in Samuel and in Kings discussing the terrible things that David did, from murder to adultery, usually to satisfy his sexual lusts or exercise his political paranoias. But what he did not do was worship other deities. He hung on steadfastly to Yahuwah, even in the midst of committing heinous sins, and did not succumb to worshipping any other than the Elohim of Israel. His heart was always for Yahusha. Solomon, on the other hand, does not appear to have engaged in adultery, at least as defined, why would you have to? At least as what's defined culturally in those days as taking another man's wife. That's the definition of adultery. Taking another man's wife is adultery. He didn't do that. And he didn't murder, not overtly. Yet in his old age he openly worshipped other deities, even if mainly to please his many foreign wives. David's punishment for his many sins against other men was to be barred by Yahuwah from building the temple. Solomon's punishment for his sin against Yahuwah, idolatry, was that Yahuwah would yank Yisrael from his grasp, in reality from Solomon's son's grasp. Thus, perhaps this is a good clue to help us understand what Yahusha meant about speaking against or blaspheming his set-apart spirit. For the committing of sins, crimes against humans, or blaspheming, lying, slandering against humans, which is also against the law of Moses, those things can be forgiven. However, blaspheming, speaking against the operation of Yahusha's set-apart spirit, cannot be. You come down hard and dig your heels in and refuse to flow with Yahusha's spirit and openly deny it and mock it and what have you of the operation of his spirit, unforgivable. The gist of this concept is perhaps best seen in Yahuwah's attitude towards David, who regularly blasphemed and committed crimes against humans, but stayed loyal to Yahuwah, versus Solomon, who generally did not blaspheme humans or commit crimes against them, but did blaspheme Yahuwah by committing idolatry, by committing idolatry. As in the Ten Commandments, whereby some commandments deal with human-to-human behaviour and others deal with human-to-Yahuwah behaviour, so we see the same in Yahusha's words in Matthew and here in 1 Kings 11, that there are crimes that are directly men against men, and thus these crimes are only indirectly against Yahuwah. But there are also crimes that don't really have a human victim, but instead are directly against Yahuwah. Idolatry is the chief of these crimes, and therefore idolatry is by definition blaspheming, assaulting the set-apart spirit. Got that? Idolatry is an abomination to Yahusha. And Solomon was right in there. It says right here. This is where his wives, 1,000 women, led him. Solomon worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of Sidon, and Milcom, the abomination that the Ammonites served. I'm not going to go into all their modern day versions of this day. Of these deities, you can see them all. Ashtaroth, Christmas trees, all that sort of stuff. Easter, it's all based on it. Read Fossilized Customs. Solomon worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of Sidon, Milcom, the abomination that the Ammonites served. And Solomon did what Yahuwah had declared was wrong. And he didn't follow Yahuwah completely and wholeheartedly as his father David had. On the mountain next to Jerusalem, Solomon built a place for worshipping Chemosh, that hideous idol of the Moabites. On the same mountain, Solomon built a place for worshipping Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites, the child sacrificing. This isn't just allowing your wives to do this, isn't it? No, I'll go and build you a statue as well. No, he got fully into it. And Solomon did the same thing for all of his other foreign wives who burnt incense and gave sacrifices to their false deities. So Solomon's heart turned away from Yahuwah, the Elohim of Yisrael, even though Yahuwah had appeared to him twice. Yahuwah just didn't appear to many people back here. He appeared to Solomon twice. He didn't actually appear to David at all. Not as explained in this. He appeared to Solomon twice. And Yahuwah was enraged at Solomon. He had told Solomon that he mustn't follow other deities, but Solomon didn't listen or obey Yahuwah's command. So Yahuwah said to Solomon, "You have chosen not to guard my covenant or laws, but to break them. So I promise that I will tear your kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But I loved your father David, so I won't take your kingdom away while you're still alive. I won't take your kingdom away from you while you're still alive. I will wait until your son becomes king. Then I will take it from him. Still, I will not tear away all of the kingdom from your son. I will leave him only one tribe to rule. And I will do this for my servant David and for Jerusalem, the city I chose." That's the prophet telling him what we just read. You going down, mate. Solomon became an idolater of grand magnitude. Even though Yahuwah appeared to Solomon twice, he never appeared to David. Yahuwah appearing to Solomon in a dream vision was a rare and amazing honour. And for Solomon to still go and worship other deities after Yahuwah personally speaking to him, personally telling him not to worship other deities, we see why Yahuwah is furious. I find it hard to believe that David had never had any kind of encounter with Yahuwah. I'm sure he did. It may not be in the official capacity or written down the same way it was for Solomon. But I'm sure David, he had the tent, David's tent, remember? With the presence, the Shekinah on top of the ark for all to see. So he'd had an experience with Yahuwah, obviously. But as far as this is defined, Yahuwah appearing to him, it hadn't happened. But it had for Solomon twice. So now here comes another Yahuwah pattern that we need to remember. Yahuwah never goes back on his word, even when it seems that he ought to. Search the scriptures, you'll find this to be true. Even today, Yahuwah never goes back on his word, even when it seems that he ought to. Yahuwah promised David that at the least one of his ancestors would be alive and qualified to be on the throne of Israel forever. So how can Yahuwah take the throne of Israel from Solomon and give it to a servant of Solomon's, who by definition would not be a family member, and yet keep his promise to David? Because doing such a thing sounds like it would be the end of David's dynasty. The answer comes in the next two verses. For the sake of the promise that Yahuwah had made to David, Solomon would not physically lose the throne of Israel. Rather, it would pass on to his son after his death, and then his son would lose the throne. But even then, what his son would lose would be his rule over the largest portion of the kingdom. But a small piece would still remain for him to rule over. When Yahuwah orders something to happen on earth, from a spiritual perspective, it has already occurred. When Yahuwah told Solomon that he would lose the throne in the form of it being taken from his son, in heaven it had already occurred. It had already occurred. Nothing good could happen upon the throne of Israel from this moment forward. What about that? From the minute this is declared, nothing good can come from the throne of Israel, since its occupant was no longer in Yahuwah's favour. Yahuwah says that he is going to give Solomon's son but one tribe to be king over. All else will be taken away from him. That single tribe will hold the territory of Judah, because Jerusalem is to remain with David's descendants. This is the place where Yahuwah has chosen to put his name, and so it will not change. As we know, Jerusalem is a shadow of his fellowship today, a shadow of the new Jerusalem that's coming. Let's go on. How did Yahuwah make this happen? Then Yahuwah raised up Hadad, the Edomite, to become Solomon's enemy. Yahuwah raised him up. Keep all this in mind. Yahuwah is in charge, in control of all of this. Just like today, who's in control of the whole world? Who's in control of everything going on? All the plagues, every single country is falling. Earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, famines. It's all Yahushua. Then Yahuwah raised up Hadad the Edomite to become Solomon's enemy. Hadad was from the royal family of Edom. Remember Edom? He came from Esau. Esau was the head of the Edomites. This is how it happened. In the past, David fought against Edom. We talked about that back in 2 Samuel 8. Joab, remember Joab, was the commander of David's army. Joab went to Edom to bury his dead soldiers. While there, Joab killed all the Edomite men who were still alive. Joab and the men of Yisrael stayed in Edom for 6 months until they had killed all the men of Edom. At the time, Hadad was only a young boy. He and some of his father's servants ran away to Egypt. They left Midian and went to Paran. In Paran, some other people joined them, and the whole group then went to Egypt. They went to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and asked for help. The Pharaoh gave Hadad a house, some land, and food to eat. The Pharaoh liked Hadad so much that he gave Hadad a wife. She was Pharaoh's sister-in-law. Pharaoh's wife was Queen Tahpenes. Hadad and the sister of Tahpenes had a son named Genubath. Queen Tahpenes let Genubath grow up in the Pharaoh's house with his children. So this Pharaoh's just giving away his daughters and left, right, and centre, isn't he? And wives. In Egypt, Hadad heard that David had died. So you get what's happening here? David's people had killed, mass genocide of these Edomite men. This guy was only young, wasn't considered a man, so they didn't kill him. Ran away to Egypt. And after many, many years of amassing a wife, a house, a family, everything, they find out that David, the reason for their pain in life, the losing of their family, the loss of their honour, it's all honour-based society back here, the loss of their honour was because of David. And in Egypt, Hadad heard that David had died, and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. So Hadad said to the Pharaoh, "Let me go home to my own country." We got plans now that they're dead. But Pharaoh answered, "I've given you everything you need here. Why do you want to go back to your own country?" Hadad answered, "Please just let me go home." Now, we don't hear of Hadad explaining the reason for his arrival in Egypt, nor his departure several years later to avenge his family's honour. But the reason for keeping quiet, especially about his departure, is obvious. David is dead, Solomon is king, and one of Pharaoh's daughters is now King Solomon's wife. Pharaoh had a very good relationship with Yisrael, was even closely allied with Yisrael by means of his daughter's marriage to Yisrael's king. And so Hadad had to keep hidden that his intent was to go back to Edom, organise and then take revenge on Solomon and Yisrael for what David and Joab had done to his people so many years earlier. See the play? Since this entire chapter is dedicated to explaining that what happened that caused Israel to be effectively dissolved and split into two houses, it was Yahuwah's anger at Solomon. Verse 14 tells us that one of the steps Yahuwah took to bring it about was to weaken the civil fabric of Israel and the hold of King Solomon upon his kingdom by raising up enemies to trouble Israel. The result will be that the aging Solomon would lose some valuable pieces of territory. The common folk of the land would become discouraged and disheartened, no longer sure of his leadership, and Israel's enemies would become confident and emboldened, and thus the table would be set for civil war. So Yahuwah knows what he's doing. That's the first enemy that was raised up from Edom via Egypt. Yahuwah also raised up another man to become one of Solomon's enemies. This man was Rezin, the son of Eliada. Rezin ran away from his master, King Hadadezer of Zobah. After David defeated the army of Zobah, Rezin gathered some men and became the leader of a small army. He went to Damascus and stayed there to rule from Damascus. Rezin became the king of Aram. He was an enemy of Yisrael throughout Solomon's life and added to the trouble that Hadad created for Yisrael. So we've got Hadad now from Moab via Egypt, causing trouble in his elite terrorist group. And now we've got Rezin, king of Aram now. This band of marauders was powerful enough that they took over the city of Damascus and settled there. Damascus was under King Solomon's rule, so when they took it over, it was a serious blow to King Solomon's reputation and to his kingdom. There isn't recorded any serious attempt by Solomon to take it back, though. Between Hadad and Rezin, they bedeviled King Solomon all the way until his death. Neither man had the resources to take on Solomon and Yisrael head on, but since Rezin had a powerful base in the north and Hadad had a powerful base in the south, they could coordinate their efforts and inflict constant torment upon Yisrael's 12 tribes. This, of course, would have given rise to calls from the tribal leaders for Solomon to do something about it, but he was never able to effectively combat either man. Why? Because Yahuwah protected them both. They were put there to be a thorn to Solomon, to destabilize his monarchy, because he said it would happen. And when he speaks, it does. It goes out and accomplishes. Besides, Solomon was the opposite of his father David. As much as David was a fierce warrior who met fire with fire, Solomon was a peaceful diplomat who preferred to negotiate and compromise and buy his way out of trouble. King Solomon inherited a kingdom won by his father by means of war. He had no aptitude or attitude that could deal with such men as Hadad and Rezin, fierce, savage warriors. No. If you can't negotiate it, use knowledge, wit, and throw money at the situation, he didn't know what to do about it. There was also another one. There was also another person who became an enemy of Solomon. He was Jeroboam. This is where Jeroboam is introduced. He was Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He was an Ephraimite from the town of Zeredah. His mother was a widow named Zeruiah. He was one of Solomon's servants, but he rebelled against the king. Now we are introduced to the third of the men who are raised up against Solomon, but this one is special. He would become far more than a mere troublemaker. He would become king over the 10 northern tribes. Because this is Jeroboam. Rehoboam was Solomon's son who eventually became king over the couple of tribes in the south. But this Jeroboam would become the king over the 10 northern tribes. This is the man who would rip away the northern part of Solomon's kingdom from him, or after Solomon's death anyway. Jeroboam rebelled and raised his hand against Solomon, meaning his rebellion was that he reproached the king in public and spoke against him in slanderous terms. The thing is this, in Middle Eastern society, that one man sought to dethrone a king and take over wasn't a sign of bad character. It happened all the time. In fact, it usually brought about a measure of admiration for his boldness and strength. However, to raise his hand against the king is different, for it speaks of going about his efforts to take over the throne in a wicked way. He's playing dirty, in other words. Take the throne in a wicked way that ran against the grain of the traditions and mindset of the shame-honour society. Thus, it was not admirable at all. So it's not a matter of right or wrong. Right and wrong to us is today, in today's society, is what the law says. If you break the law, you're wrong. Laws of the land. But here, in this time and age, it wasn't a matter of right and wrong based on judicial system. It was a shame-honour culture. So do unto others type thing. If you do something to shame me, dishonour me, I will get you back at all costs. It's not a matter of right or wrong. That's why you see, fathers who had slept with other men, or he'll just kill his daughter. You might be sad about it, but it's shame. So right and wrong goes out the door until the Torah was introduced in the official capacity. But it's a big deal back here. You break my honour, you dishonour me, you shame me, you watch out what happens. This is the story. This is what's going to happen in the last part of this chapter. This is the story about how Jeroboam turned against the king. Solomon was building the Milo. That's the big wall around the temple, the city, big Milo. And repairing the wall around the city of David, his father. Jeroboam was a brave nobleman. Solomon saw that this young man was a skilled worker, so he made him the supervisor over all the workers from the tribes that descended from Joseph. Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, having a strong personality. He was a leader of men and was quite bold and capable, so the term has nothing to do with character, only ability. Thus, unwittingly, Solomon gave him a position of power in his administration. He saw his ambition and energy and put Jeroboam in charge of the forced labour. Labour as taxes was Solomon's hallmark. That was due from the tribe of Joseph, in other words, from the 2 tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Let's be clear, Jeroboam was not in charge of all forced labour, but only for a significant portion of it. Adoram was part of the royal inner circle, and so he was the one in charge of all the forced labour, and Jeroboam would have reported to him. But one day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh met him on the road. They were alone out in the country, and Ahijah was wearing a new coat. Ahijah took his new coat and tore it into 12 pieces. New coat, tore it into 12 pieces right in front of this guy. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces of this coat for yourself, because Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, says, I will tear the kingdom away from Solomon, and I will give you 10 of the tribes. I will give you 10 of the tribes. I will let David's family keep only 1 tribe. I will do it because of my servant David and because of Jerusalem, the city that I chose from among all the tribes of Israel." You're probably doing math in your head going, 12 parts of the jacket, coat. Jeroboam, you take 10. David's only allowed 1. How does that add up? It's simple. In the shortest way to explain it, Simeon became absorbed into the tribe of Judah. Simeon, through certain atrocities back in the past that we're not going to get into, during the judges and whatnot, they kind of went extinct a bit. And the leftovers sort of got assimilated because they were right next door. They just got absorbed by the tribe of Judah. So they got this one tribe that David can retain is actually 2 tribes, but it's known mainly by 1. Judah, Jews. I will let David's family keep only 1 tribe. I will do this because of my servant David and because of Jerusalem, the city that I chose from among all the tribes of Israel. I will take the kingdom from Solomon because he stopped following me and began worshipping Ashtoreth, goddess of Sidon, Chemosh, deity of Moab, Milcom, idol of the Ammonites. Solomon stopped walking in my ways and following my directions. He does not obey my laws and commands, as his father David did. So I will take the kingdom away from Solomon's family. I chose David because he obeyed all my laws and commands. So for the sake of my servant David, I will let Solomon be the king for the rest of his life. But, Jeroboam, I will take the 10 tribes away from his son and give them to you. I will let Solomon's son keep 1 tribe to rule over. I will do this for my servant David, so he will always have someone to rule near me in Jerusalem, the city that I chose to be my own. But I will make you king of Israel, 10 northern tribes. You will rule over everything you want. And if you live right and obey all my commands, as David did, I will be with you and make your family a family of kings, just as I did for David. And you will have Israel as your kingdom. I will punish David's descendants because of what Solomon did, but not forever. But not forever. People jump on that. Not forever. See, they're going to come back. And all sorts of theories are formed from that. Achior was from Shiloh in the hill country of the tribal territory of Ephraim, which is logical since Jeroboam was venturing back into his home tribal territory, and no doubt in order to deal with some aspects of his assignment of forced labour from the Joseph tribes. Shiloh was the major priestly centre for the 12 tribes during Samuel's day. Remember, that's where the ark was, the tabernacle was, in Shiloh, until its destruction by the Philistines. However, it was rebuilt and occupied almost immediately, and for the northern tribes especially, it continued to hold a high spiritual significance, even though the tabernacle was gone, long gone from there. Thus, it is no surprise that Jeroboam would heed the words of a prophet from Shiloh. They were alone in the field. The idea is that they had to be alone for Achior to say what he did. Otherwise, he would have been reported to the king and treated as treasonous. So, obviously, Solomon catches wind of this. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam ran away to Egypt. He went to King Shishak of Egypt and stayed there until Solomon died. Everything else Solomon did from the beginning to the end is written in the book, the Acts of Solomon. Solomon ruled in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then he slept with his fathers, died, and was buried in Zion, the city of David, his father. Then Solomon's son Rehoboam became the next king. Why did Jeroboam, that's the end of Solomon, that's the end of the scripture regarding Solomon, that's the end of the chapter. Why did Jeroboam decide to raise his hand against Solomon? Because Solomon tried to arrest, execute Jeroboam, but he manages to escape to Egypt. The Pharaoh was now different. This was a different Pharaoh now. The Pharaoh that married off his daughter to Solomon and good relations with Egypt and Israel. Different Pharaoh now. The last Pharaoh of the 21st dynasty, who had been Solomon's great ally, Solomon married his daughter, was now dead. This new Pharaoh had no love for Israel or Solomon, and so was quite willing to harbour this rebel. It is important to grasp that Jeroboam had already disobeyed Yahuwah's command to him, and so he had sealed his fate with Yahuwah. Jeroboam was not obedient. He was given specific instructions that he was not to try and unseat Solomon, but rather the split of the kingdom was not to happen until Solomon's son was in power. This is in contrast to David, who was given knowledge that the kingdom would be his, but refused to lay a hand on the demented King Saul, no matter how insanely and homicidally irrational the king behaved. Recall the several examples given when David could have easily disposed of King Saul and become ruler immediately, but he would not, because he knew that this was not what Yahuwah wanted him to do. But Jeroboam took the part of Yahuwah's message that he liked and ignored the rest. He really enjoyed that part about becoming a king, but couldn't see the advantage of waiting for Yahuwah's timing and doing it Yahuwah's way in obedience. In fact, it was obvious that his intent was to rule over all Israel if he could. Not just the 10 northern tribes, but whatever he was to rule over, he wanted it now. He wanted it right now. That's the end, guys. So what did we learn from this? Doing things your own way, the consequences. Look at being led astray by all these women. And then Jeroboam, who's coming up on the heels of Solomon, and wait till you see what he's going to do with his idolatry as well. This is what leads us to the eventual exile. It's a slippery slope now. We've just seen the death of Solomon. But in the abstract and the supernatural, what is Yahusha saying to us? These are his cherished possession. These are his cherished people. At the time, his bride. And look at the great effort he went. All the way from Abraham into Egypt, the deliverance from Egypt, taking them through the wilderness to the mountain. All of that, the 10 Commandments, marrying them. Joshua, all through the Judges. King David, who he loved, and Solomon, who he loved, who built they finally had their temple, and now look what Yahuwah's doing to them. But it's because of what they did to him. One main instruction: do not worship other deities. Do not fall into idolatry. Do not have anything above me. Do not love anything more than you love me. It's simple, guys. You cannot love anything more than you love Yahusha. You can partake of things here and there in your life and have nice experiences and what have you. Do not love anything over Yahusha. It's simple. Do not be led astray. If Yahusha has you on a path, has certain things in your day, in your week, in your routine, what you're meant to do, do not let anyone, anything sway you from your path. And certainly don't go falling for the world and its idolatry. Yeah? Idolatry today could be best symbolized by the lust for money, the lusts of the flesh, all the wickedness, nudity, pornography, everything in the world that's going on. Really just the flesh. Worshipping the flesh, that's what the world is today. So guys, that's the end of Solomon. And it was a sad end to his life, wasn't it? But next chapter, I'll show you a few things that he mentioned at the end of his life. He wrote a lot of his books, Ecclesiastes and whatnot, at the end of his life, and he's pretty much said, "There's nothing new under the sun. I've done it all. I've tried it all." You got 1,000 wives, mate. You've done more than most of us have done. This is insane. And he said it's all nothing. One of the last things he says was, "Obey Yahuwah and guard his commandments." Because I didn't, and look what's happened. Not only to me, but the whole nation's, going down the tube. So that's enough for today, guys. We'll be back with the next chapter next week. Love you all. See you later.
For his, for better, for worse, for once, when it's the best case on here. Mixing up the storm, brewing up a tornado.
Having an abundance of platonic relationships reminiscent of my man Mike Plato.
I was riding down the street just